So, welcome to the next edition of the Punk CX podcast. With me today, I have Matt Powell, who is the creative director at digital product and service design agency Great State. Now, Matt has over 23 years of hands-on experience shaping digital creativity for major brands, including, no less, Apple, Pepsi, Mini, Marks and Spencer, and leading public initiatives like Change for Life. More recently at Great State, he's delivered standout projects such as Bristol Airport's sustainability strategy and the Royal Navy's rebrand. He's a specialist in blending creative direction, user experience, and tech innovation, helping brands design digital experiences that speak to fast-evolving audiences, particularly Gen Z, which we're going to talk about kind of today. So, did that all in one breath, Matt. Hope that you're impressed. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. I've never had such a grandiose introduction as that, so I'm almost blushing. But thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Now, that intro aside, that's the canned one. Can you do your own? Give me a bit of a background sketch on yourself and kind of the work that you do, just to kind of give us a more here's a personal perspective. This is what I think that I do in the work that I do on a day-to-day basis. What stuff that I'm interested in.
Yeah, as you say, I've had this privilege of working in digital pretty much since the get-go, since Google had a UK homepage. And that is great because it's just given me a perspective on how everything's evolved. I think we tend to have a real focus in the industry about talking about the last 6 months and the next 6 months. But it is lovely to be able to step back and just see how everything has evolved from the early days of kind of putting together websites without any UX, because UX hadn't been invented yet, and really with next to no strategy, and it was just sort of fumbling around, but it was very, very exciting. And as you say, it gave me the opportunity progressively to work with some amazing brands. So been around the block, and that is career, I suppose, has taken a few different forms. I would have at some point, I'm sure, called myself a digital advertising kind of creative director, then broader comms and marketing stuff and digital ecosystems for brands and all sorts of kind of things like that. Mm-hmm. And there's been a couple of real privileges, as I say. I think one of them is just I've worked with some really brilliant minds, not just those kind of strategists and engineers, but some really, really cool people. So I've done some work with the likes of David Putnam, who won an Oscar for Chariots of Fire. Mm-hmm. I've had the privilege of meeting Mark Zuckerberg. I've even had work declined by Steve Jobs, allegedly. So that's all good stuff, right? But what I found was after a while, and I think, you can relate to it. I think we're probably of a similar age. You start after a while to yearn for brands with a bit more purpose. Mm-hmm. And you need to set yourself new challenges. So around 2022, I moved to Great State, which is an independent agency. That's the kind of agency I love. And it gave me the chance to work with some organizations with a real sense of purpose. So yes, the Royal Navy, and I'll refer to them a fair amount because it is a really interesting case study and it links very much back to that subject of Gen Z. Mm-hmm. But also the RNLI, some higher education brands, and some brands closer to home, like Longleat Safari Park. So they were a CX agency, and that C does stand for customer. I think for us, it could be anything. It could be employee experience, volunteer experience, student experience. And I'm just still really, really excited by the industry.
Awesome. Now, as I mentioned in my intro, and you sort of alluded to it when you were talking kind of then, there's Gen Z, Gen Z, depending on where you're kind of from, is how it's pronounced, is a demographic that is sometimes feel like, oh, it's just them young folk over there. But they're also kind of going to bet there are growing kind of massively as a proportion of the workforce as they kind of grow up.
Totally.
And understanding them can sometimes feel, for many brands, I think, can sometimes feel quite troublesome in many ways. And so you Great State rather, and yourself kind of recently released some research called Shifting States, which examines Gen Z behaviors and digital expectations. And I had a look at it and I was like, wow, there's some really kind of cool stuff in there. That's why I wanted to kind of come on and have a bit of a rummage around some of the research.
Yeah.
So first of all, can you tell me a little bit about the research and sort of how it came about and some of the main sort of headlines, just to sort of set the tone?
Yeah, absolutely. So I name dropped a few brands and organizations we work with there. And what those organizations all have in common, we found, is that they're grappling. Grappling was the word you kind of used, troublesome, but they're grappling with meeting the expectations of that next generation. If we take that example of the Royal Navy, they recruit thousands of 16 to 24-year-olds every year, and they have to. It's not that they have a retention problem. It's just that as an organization, they tend to release people after 22 years of service. So you've constantly got people stepping out at the top, and you've got to fill that funnel. And that means with people who almost fairly and squarely fit into that Gen Z category. And that is a challenge. We're talking about an organization that's over 400 years old, but they're still hyper relevant today. You've only got to switch on television. Defense spending is making the news, every week at the moment. And that whole thing just led us down a path, really. We just sort of had to ask ourselves, do we understand Gen Z? If we're going to do that job as the agency of the Royal Navy to help them recruit that next generation. And so that just grew. It grew into a fairly sizable report in the end of the day, because a lot has been said about Gen Z, but not enough relating Gen Z preferences and how they think and how they act to customer experience as an industry. So in a nutshell, we discovered there are some misunderstandings about them, and some processes, I suppose, that agencies hold dear are a bit out of whack.
I mean, we'll come back to that kind of latter kind of point, but I think what I wanted to start with, though, is to get your perspective on, people talk about Gen Z. Sometimes it kind of can be slightly nebulous, right?
Yeah.
It's like people talking like, boomers and Gen X and millennials and Gen Zs, and these words get thrown around, but we don't actually know really kind of what sort of proportion of the population, the working population that we're talking about, and how their influence and proportions is predicted to grow over the coming kind of years.
Definitely.
And so I thought I'd ask you is like, give us a sense, kind of like where we're at and what's likely to happen, because then it, I guess, puts our arms around the problem, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think the basic fact of it is we're talking about those people born roughly in the sort of late 90s and maybe 97, 98 onwards to about 2010. So what we're looking at today as we see them is those people who are age 15 to late 20s. That probably represents, because every country is different, right? They have different aging kind of demographics. You look over at countries like Japan, they have kind of challenges which are different to our own. But we're talking about 18 to maybe to 20% of the UK population.
Okay.
Now that number won't change, right? That's the percentage that they are. But I think you'll see that will, as they shift, as you say, 15 to late 20s, you're talking about people who are still in education, still gaining qualifications, or perhaps being in first jobs. So we're talking about those people really coming on stream progressively and becoming the consumers with the spending power. And we know that's a big influence on everything we do. So they're going to become more integral to the workforce. They're going to really come into their prime. And I think that will therefore turn into influence. I think we're seeing that we need to lean into their sensibilities, and that actually older audiences that are still part of the equation will fold in. I think you can do things which will either sort of ostracize older audiences to reach younger ones, but we try to find that balance between being really inspired by them rather than see them as a problem, and then find ways to sort of cultivate that so it doesn't kind of push away older demographics when we're building, say, a site or something.
Awesome. And so thank you for that. I mean, just because it's a good context setting, but I want to kind of then circle back to the thing that you kind of alluded to before, and it's mentioned in the report.
Yeah.
Because there's a bit in the report that talks about old methods, old tools, old thinking. And then I was reading through the report and I was like, then it's quickly followed by the line which says, quality has been sacrificed for quantity as the optimization runs at full tilt.
Yeah.
And I was like going, there's a mic drop kind of like line.
Yeah.
So tell me, what are you getting at kind of here?
Yeah. Look, part of that experience, I suppose, of working in marketing is that I feel like we've kind of seen that there's ways of working and there's schools of thought, and they have been, relied upon, and they're no longer going to be fit for purpose. I really feel like, having done this research into Gen Z, I feel that, and I'll point out kind of three of them to you now, but I think that are fundamentally a bit broken as techniques. So I think The first one is think about, if you've rattled around agencies a little bit like I have, you know that they're full of things like marketing playbooks, quite fixed personas of people, and you realize you look at the data on that kind of like, this is the persona of our audience, and it's dated from 2, 3 years ago.
Hmm.
You've got things like publishing pillars and publishing strategies.
Hmm.
You've got reach and frequency models. You've got all of these things which we quite like, I think, as an industry, because they make us feel like experts, and agencies are under a lot of pressure to kind of get results. So
Hmm.
you kind of need methodologies to do that. But I think what we're seeing is the evidence that Gen Z just won't respond to the outputs of using those kind of methods. They're thinking more fluidly than that. They're more agile, and they're seeing the world through slightly different kind of lenses. And if you, for example, you take a publishing pillar and you're kind of repeatedly talking about the same things again and again, I just don't think it's going to wash, because there isn't the same level of trust and belief in kind of what you're saying that there once was. So that's your first one.
Yeah, go on.
Do you want me to go?
Yeah, yeah,
Shall I
no, no,
just
go on.
keep going?
I'm just going to keep going. So I'm going to come back to that sort of the contextual kind of bit around kind of what you
Yeah.
talked about there. Don't follow certain paths, but let me not interrupt. And so we've got pillar one,
Yeah.
pillar two.
Chasing trends.
Ah,
So I think this is one which, again, we've kind of, as an industry, has really, really fallen foul of, really kind of getting into reactive marketing, grabbing at some popular influencer at the moment to promote things. We're just not seeing, I think, the Gen Z are as influenced by those sorts of things as they were. Maybe that's because of the sort of just sheer vast amount of content there is out there. Whether it's, we're seeing kind of more trends around de-influencing as well, rather than influencing, which we could come on to as well. But I think chasing trends isn't a way forwards. And I think it's far too much energy expelled on doing that to try and look credible. And the focus is on the wrong thing.
right.
And the
And
third one, if we do it
yes,
quickly,
yeah,
is this is you mentioned optimization, the optimization model.
yes.
I saw sort of really firsthand, the way that optimization took off as a sort of philosophy for doing things.
Mhm.
Running out multiple permutations of experience, just testing things relentlessly until you get to the optimal performing thing. And I
Mhm.
think there are challenges with that, because I think with Gen Z, they're coming across as lacking authenticity. There's not any uniqueness about that. It's just relentlessly following the numbers. So I think it misses the beat with kind of great craft. And I think we're starting to see the link between Gen Z and aesthetics and craft being really, actually really important. So I think optimization faces some challenges going forward.
So on that last point, I thought it was interesting because that's interesting because actually, to the end of every year, I take on this was an increasingly gargantuan task of producing a set of customer experience predictions for the set of the years.
Sure.
I don't write them myself, so I've got no crystal ball. But I do is I invite a whole bunch of people. It's quite open to submit their thoughts, and then I try and curate them into a set of themes. And this last year, I ended up having about 400 different predictions from about 300 different folk that I cut down into about just over 40, and then curated them into about like 15 different sort of like themes with some commentary and narrative around it. And interestingly, the thing that emerged from that was this idea about like branding and about actually doing almost like old school kind of branding. Do something that stands out. Don't just follow the trends, because actually the environment, if you think about SEO and paid for search and all of these different sort of things, and how people use their data and stuff, like the whole kind of optimization and performance marketing type side of things, how that was being almost like completely upended by these answer engines kind of there as coming into the space and what they're doing, and how the cost of keywords and stuff is becoming so competitive and so expensive that there's this pressure to rethink, how do you actually reach people, how do you connect with people, how do you do it in the right sort of kind of way, and how old school kind of branding is going to be take more of a front and center role, it feels like. and because you got to connect with kind of people. And then I think, and then it made me think about also going. You go back to that sort of thing you talk about, old thinking and stuff, and it made me think about back to also the kind of Gen Z side of things and where they're coming from. And it seems to me that some of this thinking is based on old assumptions. Um, and there's a quote I love that comes from Alan Alda, the American actor.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
who apparently was he actually gave a commencement sort of speech at his daughter's college one year, and there was a part in the speech, and this is a quote that I've used frequently, but I just love it. And he said, assumptions are your windows on the world. You should clean them off once in a while so you can see clearly. And I love that.
Hmm.
And you're talking about this kind of things are kind of broken, and I want to just to ask you about what assumptions are we getting wrong about Gen Zs? Like, where are they coming from? What are the things that are kind of broken? What do we need to understand in terms of their context and why they're as the report says, why they're predictably unpredictable?
Yeah. And before I kind of answer that, I'll just pick up on that point you made about brand. I don't know all the answers, but what I do know is that you always treat our clients with respect because they're really smart people. And one of my mantras is that the most underestimated quality in award-winning work is the client because their instincts are often very, very right. And what we have found in the last probably 18 months is a greater emphasis on brand, on visual brand. Now, I know brand for me I was always taught that brand was promise, personality, and product. It's a layered thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm talking about, branding moves forward. It's not, I think it's a good idea to get stuck in the past, but I think we've seen a bit of a renaissance of a new version of branding being really important.
Yeah.
It's more dynamic. It's more digital first. It's more interactive than it's ever been. But it's a very important layer and it means a lot to our clients and they're investing in that. So I think that is a bit of a bellwether sign.
Yeah.
But if we go back to your question, then there's that phrase, and it comes up in that report, doesn't it, about predictable unpredictability, which in itself feels a bit kind of like, hang on, what are we talking about there? So but the point is this, right? So I think Gen Z, let's call them Gen Z, appear to be very, very unpredictable.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I think one of the first brands to really acknowledge this was Vogue Business, and they famously said that Gen Z broke the marketing funnel.
Mm-hmm.
And it's true, we're not seeing this group going through the very standard buckets of awareness, interest, desire, action in a convenient manner. And I say that because we've seen it with the Royal Navy. As I say, we're interested in not selling them a product, but interesting them in a career. And we see the analytics that you would anticipate people perhaps seeing us on social, seeing fantastic photography of ships and careers, and then coming to the site, perhaps then exploring it as a broad role. Is this a career path for me? Could I do it? What are the pros and cons? And then maybe settling in and going, okay, what do my qualifications entitle me to do? And we don't see that. We see people coming to the site, landing straight onto a role, then going backwards and having a look at some of the wider material, then leaving the site to go to social. So it's almost, it's this kind of messy middle that we kind of see ourselves in. And we've had to kind of engineer things to sort of expect that a little bit, never assume you've seen us before, and actually kind of like take any touch point as an opportunity to just create a bit of positive influence.
Mm-hmm.
But as I say, the thing that we really got to the nub of in the report was to challenge the idea of chaotic. And you covered it yourself at the very, very beginning. This is a generation who've pretty much only experienced uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
When we look back at it, there was a point in time in their formative years when they had 3 prime ministers in the space of 44 days. They thought they were going to school and then COVID arrived. They thought they might have plans to travel and then suddenly you have things like Brexit. Even simple fundamental things like money, get a job, earn some money. All of that's just been inverted as well. We've had crypto and we've had Mr. Beast making a mockery out of earning a living. I myself had an influencer as part of my team. And I remember really having this conversation with her where she said, do you mind if I do some paid posts for a product? And I said, well, unfortunately I do, because that product is a competitor to one of the clients that we have as an agency. And she said, yes, but I can earn more money doing those 3 posts than you pay me in a year. And I remember thinking, oh,
Blimey.
what is going on? What is going on? And you kind of realize that, even some of those simple things like foundational things that we'll kind of grow up with and expect were just not there. And you've only got to add in fake news and a bunch of other stuff as well. And you realize, that's going to have a profound effect on their psyche, I suppose. Ironically, I was thinking about this the other day. Probably one of the most consistent things, other than things like family, obviously, which still exists. But if you look out there in the commercial world, probably the iPhone's one of the most consistent things because it's been around since 2007 and just gone through small evolutions, but it's always been in your hand. So weirdly, there hasn't been a lot of consistency, but technology's sort of been one of them. But anyway, go on. Sorry.
No, so I think that's the thing is that I know we were talking before we started recording, is that we must appreciate. Now it's easy to say, but it's harder to actually get, as it were, when you say that. So you and I are of an age where we knew of the world pre-internet, which would be completely anathema to kind of Gen Z. Like, what do you mean? Like, right, and that's pre-mobile phone and kind of pre-internet. And we lived our life and grew up, understanding, that you can live in just a little bubble and you can be unplugged from the news and information and things. And then the world felt really large. And then things kind of changed. And now it's like everything feels very local. The world feels very small, because it's almost like we're connected. And I think that's what I mean about we can say that people are digitally native, but actually what we need to really understand and really spend some time thinking about is, what does that actually mean from their perspective contextually? And what is it? How do they feel? How does it drive their behavior? Because actually, and it's going to continue to change with the advent of, and the massive rise of artificial intelligence, particularly around generative AI, and how that's going to changing lots of different things, and will continue to change things. And it's almost about foundationally, based on how you and I would think, that foundationally things are getting eroded, and you almost have to be. I was thinking about this the other day. There's a film that Eddie Murphy was in, and I think it's called The Magic Dagger or something, and he's jumping from across this chasm from post to post, but they're almost disappearing, sort of thing. But he's got to keep moving in order to cross this thing, and it feels like that. It feels quite precarious.
Yeah, I think that might be The Golden Child.
Child, thank you. Yes, that's right.
I remember seeing it at the cinema. Great fun. Yeah. And so we're trying to make sense of that. And, where we've arrived at is, as you say, why wouldn't those things kind of change your brain chemistry? I think what we've realized is, though, that it isn't chaotic. They're just incredibly good at adapting.
Right.
And we really kind of use this word of fluidity.
Okay.
And what I mean by that, to try and not get into the realm of buzzwords, is just, if you've learned something to be true one day, and then in social media it's disproved the next day, then it's okay to be of a sort of person that goes, okay, this is what I think is good or bad today, and I reserve the right to have a different opinion on that tomorrow. I'm going to be fluid enough to not get in a rut. I'm going to continuously process, continually absorb, and continually decide what is right and what's wrong and what's good and what's bad. And actually, I think if you can understand that, then you can start to say those things, like those playbooks I was talking about 5 minutes ago, don't work, because their mentality or their approach could be to a brand, it could be to a career, it could be to anything, may not be the same as it was, based on processing all of this information. So yeah, we need to kind of think of them as being extremely fluid, and therefore agencies need to fall in step with that. And
so then let's maybe kind of like address some sacred cows that go around kind of Gen Zs, because there is a lot of, there's a lot of kind of talk that says, it's all about sustainability, or it's all about personalization. Is that true? Or is it fluid?
Yeah, I'd say not entirely true. And I'm conscious of this being a research piece that was done around about 2000 people. But and as I say, everybody's kind of unique. But if we just kind of try to aggregate the numbers a little bit, we found that maybe 90% of people said that things like social responsibility and values and sustainability would be an influence on them following a brand
Hmm.
or approving of a brand. But conversely, only about a quarter of people said that they really actively researched things like sustainability practices.
Right.
So you could say there's a sort of contrary thing there. It's important, but I won't actually go out of my way to research it. I think though, just as a brand, if you're a brand with values,
Hmm.
what that means is you should get those front and center. They're important, but you've got to kind of make the effort to kind of put that in that experience or that journey.
Hmm.
Make it really easy for them to discover it. Relay that with as much authenticity as you can muster, and make it engaging as well. And then I think that's a potentially a bit of a recipe for winning. So if
Okay.
we take again, just head back to Royal Navy for a for an example, less sustainability, but more about say something like other sort of values. You know, the Royal Navy does really good things, humanitarian relief, and protecting kind of people from piracy and those sorts of things. Those are good, solid things to talk about. And actually, most people at a superficial level don't even stop and consider those things. So what we try to do, even though people are moving around in non-linear ways these days, is try to make sure those are visible so that as you're traversing the site or having an experience, you come across those things and we portray them, keep it brief, keep it concise, keep it punchy, but make sure those values are landed so that they can make their own decision whether that's right for them or not.
Hmm. And I just want to go back and ask on the kind of personalization. I mean,
Hmm.
is it is it super important as well, or is it like is it one of those things that people are a bit like, yeah, it's nice, but because everybody's like in the industry, everybody in the customer experience space is like, oh
Yeah.
yeah, it's personalization or nothing,
Yeah.
and you're like going, is it there?
Well, I kind of anticipated you'd ask about personalization, and I almost wanted to begin with a caveat. As a creative director, I'm a comparatively simple creature. I remember years ago when I worked on Marks and Spencers, the guys tried to sit down with me and explain the personalization strategy that they were going to take. Afterwards, I said, "No, I just don't get what you're saying." And I said, "Okay, let me put it this way. We're going to try and do things that feel serendipitous rather than stalk people." And okay, got it. And we just kind of like, that's about as deep as I could manage to get around it. But
Yeah.
if we loop forward to today, you made a really interesting point there. Gen Z, I think they just expect personalization now. It's kind of a bit intolerable to kind of work with kind of irrelevant material. And I think, as you say, though, the watch out there is, the first rule of personalization is no personalization is better than bad personalization. I
Mhm.
think is kind of one of those things that still rings true today. If we look at it though, again, I don't want to kind of get mired in statistics, but we kind of said, again, 85% or so of Gen Z engage with personalized content. It's a good driver for engagement.
Mhm.
But we see very, very low amounts of people who are comfortable with their data being used freely.
Yeah.
So that sounds, again, you could draw out of that sounds quite contrary. I don't want my data being used, but I do want a personalized experience. So how does that work? And I think what we've got to do is just kind of get to that place where we don't see things like opting in or kind of that consent for data as just a tick box exercise. You've got
Hmm.
to see that as the start of a really interesting creative brief.
Yeah.
If you think about the use of data, you can turn that into a really interesting conversation to have with people and go, you know what, we'd really like you to make you feel like a VIP. And
Hmm.
we're going to give a lot if you give us a little bit. And actually, there should be more focus on that. What creatively can you do? How do you create the win-win where the organization uses data responsibly and the Gen Z sort of person you're trying to speak to feels like it was a fair trade
Hmm.
rather than it just being these kind of casual or last minute, just stick something on there that says, can you opt in so we can spam you, please?
I mean, I think the I think it was probably about 7 years ago, I think it was Forrester coined this kind of like this idea. There's a personalization paradox. Exactly, kind of like to what you said is like going.
Mm.
The majority of people say they want personalization. I think that's a good thing. Majority of brands want to deliver it,
Yeah.
but also customers have this serious concerns about data privacy, security, and all these different sort of things. And I think the one thing that the brands, not many brands do, because it feels like I don't know why they don't do it as much as they should, is like almost being transparent about what sort of data they're collecting and kind of why and how they're using it. I see people trying to do it, and so like and but it gets mired in the whole data privacy policies and kind of like, do you accept this or do you accept that, and all these different sort of things. But I think there feels to me there's room for people to be a bit more upfront and center within their comms about this. This is what we promise. This is what we're going to do, but take it out of legal speak in many ways.
Yeah.
And just be
Yeah.
kind of like, if you want to be personal, then be personal about it. Don't get your lawyer to talk to the customer. Like talk to the customer yourself as if you're a person. You're like going, we take this because this is good. We guard this as if it's our own, and we use it for this. And I think that sort of level of transparency would actually build that sort of trust and alleviate some of those concerns. Don't you
Yeah,
think?
I do. Transparency. And I think it links back a little bit to something we were talking about 5 minutes ago, which is brand.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what you're describing there and that sort of legalese sort of language, well, is that how your brand would speak to somebody? And we're seeing again, as well as visual brand guidelines, verbal brand guidelines becoming important for a couple of reasons. I think that is one of them. So it doesn't descend into that sort of language where you suddenly feel very distant from what the organization, but simply by the tone that they're using. But also because of AI, because more of it is going to be conversational, because it is going to be sort of two-way dialogue. I think, there's a lot more emphasis on that brand finding that voice, a strong voice that isn't just a generic voice. So all of these things start to sort of overlap a little bit at some point. And I think personalization, though, I don't think what I'm not sitting here saying is kind of back away from it for data issues. I think it just needs to be done responsibly, and actually, it's important. I think it's now an expectation rather than an advantageous thing. I think you'd see people backing away from brands that don't get them.
Yes.
And I think personalization is parallel to that idea of getting me.
But I do think there's a choice, right? It's like going back to a point that you made before. It's like it's
Totally.
not just like a continuum. It's almost like a chasm between 2 points. You either do it well and do it right and do it well on the one side of things and really commit to it, or don't do it at all and just distinguish yourself in a sort of a generic kind of way. Because actually, like you said, it's like no personalization is better than bad personalization. And so it's almost a bit like a binary thing. It's like, if you're going to do it, then do it and commit to it and do it right.
Yeah.
Because you'll get rewarded for that.
Yeah.
But be careful because people will see through it. And again, I go back to another piece of research back from that sort of time, about 6-7 years ago. One of the most alarming, there was a parallel piece of research. One of the most alarming sort of like stats was that, I can't remember who did it, but they were asked all marketeers about personalization. So like, it's brilliant. But then they also kind of like said about 65% of all the marketeers admitted that some of the things that they would have done they themselves would describe as being creepy.
Yeah.
And so it's a bit like going, make sure that you're on the right side of the line, as it were.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, as I say, I've kind of been around seeing sort of media agencies and creative agencies. And I think one of those there is that disturbing phrase, isn't there? Sort of the dark arts of how some of these things work. And I think that's obviously should cause a bell to kind of ring that something's not quite right. I think we're going to see, like, I'll give you an example, just, how familiar we are now with having dark mode, light mode. On a which would you prefer from a sort of comfort and accessibility kind of perspective? I think you see more sites with a kind of like the personalized or the non-personalized version. So you can just toggle and just see how that kind of changes. Or that a few more sites I think you see going, this is actually what we know about you or what we think we know about you. Would you like to erase that? Do you want to correct it? Do you want to add to it? And a bit more of that sort of stuff. So again, it feels really, really transparent. And I think brands have got a real responsibility to do that kind of stuff because they are custodians of your data. I think one of the things that's interesting as well is, we see these stories about data leaks, but I think unless things have an impact on you, say you had your data, somebody kind of sort of faked being you and kind of took money from your account, you'd obviously have a huge and immediate and visceral kind of reaction to that. But I think we see these data leaks sometimes happen and they're reported on the news, but it has no bearing on you personally. So they soon go away for that reason. And that isn't a Gen Z thing. I think it's just a kind of human nature thing. You sort of nod, but if it doesn't have a material impact on you, then you sort of don't stress about it too much. But I think it is a huge area. We all know that there's thousands of data points on you, and it's just remembering we've got a responsibility there.
Yeah. And so you've painted this picture of let's call it, reuse the phrase of predictable and predictability. And to help kind of brands build that reciprocal loyalty, I mean, I know it's not just the report's not just a piece of research, but there's some guidance in there around how brands can build that reciprocal loyalty. And you've distilled it into 5 principles. And I wonder if you could tell me about them kind of briefly and kind of what they mean for brands' marketing activities.
Yeah, I'm, as I say, I love being a practitioner rather than the sort of theoretical kind of person. So we did kind of want to turn it into things that we can do as sort of actual good habits. 5 then. So I think the first of those was just commit to continuous discovery.
Okay.
So as I said, you've got you don't want to be kind of leaning on older documentation on how to do things. Constantly try and listen, constantly try and adapt and question your assumptions about what Gen Z needs. Now, that might sound a bit trite, but I think it's gone, that sort of agility and continuous discovery thing, it's sort of gone from being a buzzy word thing to being really essential now. And the good news is there's just so many tools. We use some interesting tools like Ballpark and Askable. They're great ways of doing quick user research and getting a quick turnaround. And as a creative director, I'm working with designers. And there's all sorts of tools. We're working extensively in Figma, but, they're constantly adding tools that will allow you to turn a flat design into a sort of a moving prototype. Again, that gives you much realer assets, much faster, again, to test, put them into the mix, see how people kind of, do they like them? Do they not? Is something missing from that? So yeah, continuous discovery rather than very long and bloated kind of processes, waterfall processes where you just end up with a product at the end of it. Just keep on asking, is this right? Could we do it better? Second one, I think, is just, and I cannot overstress this one, is creating effortless experiences. We just hear it time and again, whether we're doing vox pops, whether we're doing sort of quantitative research. People want ease and speed. Make it frictionless. Really put the energy and the time into the touch points, including the ones further down the process. I sort of mentioned earlier, there's a lot of emphasis on the top of the funnel, but I think looking at making the experience as frictionless as possible and easy to use is absolutely where the win is. We see both analytically and in terms of, as I say, research, people will walk away from, particularly in that audience demographic, will walk away from inconvenient things. So that's the second one really is.
Can I make effortless experiences? I just want to make a note on that or attach maybe to comment on that, because I think it also, because people can pick these up and run with them, right? These ideas. And you mentioned friction too. People talk about they conflate sort of the effortless with friction free. And the thing I always kind of think about that is that, but we need to also understand there's such thing as good and bad friction.
Yes, totally.
Right? And if you eliminate both, sometimes you can undermine the value that you create through that sort of interactive kind of process. I remember hearing a story about a brand. It was an e-commerce brand. They got stuck into this. Let's make it friction free, and they did all that, and they're straight through, made it super easy. Customers coming in, do what they need to do, and then came out the back end. So the processing was kind of much faster. But what they found was that their ability to retain customers just fell through the floor. And the reason when they stopped and they investigated, the thing that they found was actually there was a point in the process where the customer had to make a certain number of choices that was actually about their own choice.
Yeah.
And that was the choice friction in that sort of like journey that actually created the value because it empowered them with things and they go like, I want this and I want that and I want this and that made it their own.
Yeah.
And when they end up winding that back, keeping some of the elimination of the bad friction, but then reinstating some of the good friction, then things started to reinstate themselves. And so I just put like a health warning on some of that stuff.
Yeah, I think it's a lovely kind of build on what I was talking about there. To tell you the design pattern that worries me most that it's gone is the one about putting in card details, 16-digit card details in your CVV, because that was a cooling off, a micro cooling off period, right? That was that chance for the people to go, do I really need this? Do I really want to buy it? Or could I live without it? And that's been actually, I'd say, we've robbed people of that. Now it is just Apple Pay done. And I suppose things like that are part of the reason why I wanted to get into more an agency with more brands on the books that were not about kind of just converting people and not just about sort of selling consumerism into things with a bit more value, because things like that are a little bit troubling. And we're getting to that place where people are willing to make purchases on mobile, life-changing purchases on mobile. The joke. There's a good joke in social media which is about millennials going, "Oh, I've got to move from my mobile phone to my laptop for that. That's a big decision." Whereas we don't see that. We see people expressing an interest in joining the Navy on their phone, just like that. Now, the good news is, don't worry, you don't just kind of press a button and that's it. You're going to get dragged into a naval base. There's a lot of process about aptitude and eligibility and are you sure and all of those sorts of things. So I can sleep well at night knowing that if you hit that button going, I'm interested, you're not signing your life away.
Excellent. And so that took us to what, 2 principles? So what's the third one?
It's guiding people. And I kind of think this is a nice allied point to the one that you're making. What we see is, you see, people roving around and getting the information they need from as many sources as necessary. Now, this one, so what we're saying is to just help people, just take the time to think, can reviews, can user-generated content, can strong community signals help you arrive at the right decision? One of the things we looked at was what sort of things on your phone do you trust the most? And the one that came out for Gen Z that they trusted the most was Reddit.
Okay.
And of course, Reddit is that sort of, big, bumbling kind of massive kind of real kind of comments. But interesting that scored really highly.
But it's real people. It's real people talking about real things, right? And it's just perspective, and it's like you just like throw yourself into the middle of the community, and you find you see kind of what the opinion is, and then you might be more informed. You might not necessarily be sold on it, but you're more informed because it's not, if you like, brand generated content. It's just people's opinions.
Yeah. And what we noticed that was particularly challenging with something like the Royal Navy. So they've changed a lot over probably the last 20, 30 years. You can imagine, like a lot of organizations, the mentality is fantastic now. But if you go back, like any organization, there's a few salty sea dogs and people probably with quite old-fashioned views on the world. And what we found was that people were roving around looking for information about, could I join, should I join, and ending up in forums or chat rooms with some of those kind of slightly older opinions on how things work. And we didn't kind of want to expose people to that because we didn't think it was representative of the modern experience. So what we ended up doing for the Royal Navy was actually building a new content format. We called it Stories, and it was basically the sort of material you would get from social media, but plugged into the site. So it's a full screen experience, a bit, it borrows from the design pattern of Instagram stories. Just tap for the next full screen, sort of just working through sort of snacks of visuals and little kind of factoids. And it kind of almost emulates that experience of going out to social media to try and get that additional evidence. And we did use more authentic imagery and truer, more human stories in there, so that the main site experience was the massive, incredible photography of aircraft carriers and destroyers and things like that. But then there was this slightly more human, hey, this is what it's kind of like. This is what life in board is like, or here's the little human side of things, so that people could get more of what they needed in that experience, and it be really modern, up to date content.
Awesome.
So that's three.
Great.
I'll rattle through the other two. I
Okay.
think fourth one thankfully we've already covered off. It's that one about chasing trends. I think
Right.
trends are very fleeting. Gen Z, I think, see through a lot of that kind of reacting marketing stuff now. And I'd say, yeah, focus the attention on making them feel like VIPs further down the process rather than just chase the kind of reactive stuff. And that fifth one we've also covered off as well. It's that one about uniqueness. And which I really firmly put at the feet of the brand development. This generation do get bored easily. They do value aesthetics more than I think other generations. So find that brand differentiator, codify it into a design system, make sure that interacting with your brand feels different to any other. Even if you cover the logo and that picture, you could still tell it's that organization. There's something about the way that you interact with it. It's kind of its personality on the screen is important, really, really important. So being unique and sticking with that, I think, is that fifth attribute.
Awesome. Matt, that, to be fair, that sounds like a lot. If you're going to listen to this, is it like a brand kind of person or a marketeer and stuff? And so I thought, well, so apart from actually recommending everybody download the research, and I'll put a link to the kind of the research in the show notes and things.
Yeah, cool.
What should marketeers be doing first to dive into this? Because this might, there might be a case of like some people might be thinking, well, yeah, I think I had I might have had an understanding or grip on or grasp of what was going on here, but you're telling me a whole bunch of things that might make me go, shit, I've got a lot of work to do. Where should I start?
I sometimes start the day thinking that as well. Okay. If we summarize it, I think, how do you start? I think what we're saying is, one, prototype fast.
Mm-hmm.
Don't kind of sit on things for a long time. Think about ways to sort of spin up ideas quickly. You may want to kind of, build it properly on a good solid kind of technology stack later, but prototype first and find out if things are working. Second of all, yeah, just throw away, I think, those really rigid personas. Start with a bit of a blank sheet when it's kind of like, who's our audience for this one? Mm-hmm. Third one, I think, do prioritize quality design over trendy content. I think fourth is that we're seeing adaptability and agility is really important. And the most common thing we hear when clients come to us is normally around technology and engineering. It's, I'm too rigid. I can't move with the times. So work and collaborate with clients to build really adaptable technology sort of stacks, I think, so that you can move. Things like headless CMSs, things like that are really important.
Okay.
And I think finally, just rethink your KPIs. We all love a key performance indicator. Just focus on the relationship rather than just on cheap conversion tactics.
Perfect. Thank you. And so we've rattled through a whole bunch of kind of different things. You give me some great advice. Before we get to some quick fire questions to wrap up, anything that you want to add or highlight that we've missed out?
No, only that, we have barely touched on AI today. I think we know it's going to change.
It's not a bad thing.
It's not a bad thing. You'll have I'm sure, no shortage of people talking about it. It will change everything, but maybe good to give people a breather from it just this once. It's on our mind a great deal, like every agency, I suppose, but maybe not one for today.
Well, exactly. I mean, I think the thing is, like what I would say is that, yeah, it's an important dimension, but we're talking about people kind of here. And actually, I think for me, the important thing to think about is, how are these things influencing kind of people's kind of behavior, but they're not it's not the people themselves. And what we're focusing on is we're talking about the people themselves and the things that influence them and how they think and kind of what their preferences are. And that is just one and a growing kind of influence on our kind of behavior, but it's not the only thing that's influencing our behavior.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Perfect. So Quick fire questions. I've got three of them. Let's kind of. So here's the first one. So I always ask people to boil everything down a little bit, and the way I've been doing that recently is to ask people to complete this sentence. And the sentence is this: if you want to improve your, say, your customer experience, Matt says, do this. Complete that sentence.
I would say be more fluid. I'm going to keep it that short. I think we're in an era of moving quickly and not being stuck in your ways. Understand your audiences are continuously moving, evolving mindset, forming and reforming views on the world. So you have to be too. My answer to the question is be more fluid.
Fantastic. Love that. So second one, and I would be remiss of me if I didn't ask a punk related one. So here
Sure.
goes. What company or brand do you think takes a more punk approach to CX, and why?
So when you asked me that, you sent that question over before, my answer was that I thought I won't answer this. I'll go and ask somebody from Gen Z. So we have a really promising, wonderful creative called Eve in our team. And I said, okay, what's a good example for this? And she pointed me towards the light phone. I don't know if you've come across this one yet. This is one of those incredibly brave / foolhardy attempts to make a device which is simpler. So we talked a little bit about ethics earlier on, about trying to do something about this mental health challenge that we have, about giving people tools to endlessly scroll. There is such a thing as a company that makes a phone which doesn't permit you to do that, and it's called the Light Phone. And the reason I mention it now is because they just bring out the Light Phone 3, and it is genuinely, it's a product. It has an e-ink screen rather than a Retina pixel screen, which you can't wait to look at. It's a phone that does not allow email. It does not allow social media. It doesn't allow a lot of things. You can make calls. You can do some basic listening of music and get some basic directions on it. But it's an aesthetic thing of beauty as well. It's a beautiful object that sort of emerged out of this desire to create something simpler that allows you to focus on the real world. And actually, I don't want to seem too hypocritical, because we do a lot of things which are mobile first and are optimized towards iPhones and Samsungs and things like that. But I think there's a place in the world for a product like this. I'm quite sure their marketing budget in a year is probably less than, say, one of those big phone manufacturers spend in a day. But I really wish them well, because they've created a lovely object which really makes you stop and think about our kind of addiction to phones, really.
Yeah, perfect. Love that. And then my last question, which I've been asking for a while right now, because I've been reflecting on, how much the world feels like it's in a very, very weird, quite scary place right now. And I think if there's anybody who's a Gen Z listener, will be going like, that's kind of normal. It's always been thus. Well, for some people that are slightly older in the tooth, like myself, and maybe yourself, kind of, Matt, is like I think you would agree that the world feels kind of bumpy right now.
I do.
And there's a lot of kind of like bad news floating around. And so what I've been asking people to do is to share with me a good news story so we can end on a high. So,
yeah. And I thought you could return your back on all of that world, that sort of slightly dystopian world, or you could find a happy and slightly joyful reaction to it. So I would point you towards Professor Ethan Mollick's blog, and that's called One Useful Thing. And on almost day one of AI's kind of ability to generate images, he was on an aeroplane with his daughter and said, "Hey, let's make something. What should we make?" And she suggested her favorite animal, which was an otter. So he used it to create an image of an otter on an aeroplane using Wi-Fi, using a and of course, what came through was something extremely garbled and complicated and weird that looked more like an aeroplane covered in a rug, as it sort of struggled to sort of synthesize this image. And then he's taken a picture of an otter using a device on a plane ever since, with every single iteration of it, and it's turned into a lovely and charming sequence. And actually, it makes you a little bit less intimidated by it all. And of course, being a professor, he goes into profound insights into how it works, how AI thinks, and what is going on, which again, I think takes a little bit of the fear away. When you understand how something operates, you can sort of feel a bit warmer towards it. So, Professor Ethan Mollick's Otter.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I've never heard of that, so I will definitely go and look that up. But Matt, just want to say thank you for that. That's all I have for today. I just want to say thank you for sharing your time, your expertise, and also the insights from the report, kind of from me, with me rather. That's been awesome. So thanks very much.
Adrian, thank you so much for having me on. It's been a really enjoyable conversation, and it's been a real pleasure to meet you.
Wow, what a great interview. I hope you enjoyed it. I know I did. Find out more about me and the work that I do at adrianswinscoe.com. Do leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. And if you have any comments, feedback, or questions about the podcast, then feel free to send me a message to podcast@adrianswinscoe.com. And do tune in again. Thanks very much.